I was noticing that in this magnificent room with all the technology, there's not an analog clock.
Right.
You know, that's what time it is. So.
It's maybe a feature.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and thank you everybody for having me today. And it's amazing how you manage, you know, the audience here, the audience in China, and everywhere else in the world. So this is ongoing work that I'm very happy to present today, and I'm just wondering whether I have a yes, brilliant. Brilliant. I did say
always works.
It does not always work.
The space bar always works. Oh,
so what is it working now? Brilliant. Okay, great. So this is ongoing work together with Alessandro Bonatti from MIT and Tang Gan, who's also at Yale, and then back there. What we're trying to understand is a little bit the economics and the demands and supply of data on the large internet platforms. So just think in the US, Amazon, Facebook, Google, think in China, JD, Tencent, Alibaba, who really have and are, you know, continuing to collect unprecedented amounts of information. Information about individuals that tell us a lot about their preferences, their opinions, their political views, their location, their social network. And a lot of this information basically is being used then to provide services such as recommendations, such as location, such as traffic data, such as ratings. And what we're trying to understand is a little bit what is the value of this data, what is the prices at which this data flows through the system, and think a little about systematically what is the efficiency. At the core of the analysis that we're going to present today is the idea that all of this individual data, it really at its core, and what makes it useful for the platforms is the social aspect of the data. This data that is collected about any specific individual is valuable because, of course, it tells me something about the individual, but it's even more valuable because it tells me something about people who are in some metric, in some distance, close to that individual. And so as I'm generating information on the platform about my own preferences, my own location, my own views, I'm also generating information of people who are like me or who are near me, who are just like me in some dimension. So that naturally generates an informational or data externality that is at the core of the interaction between the individuals and so we basically want to think about collecting individual data, but we want to emphasize the aspect that really what is being generated, social data, and then we want to think about whether the pricing of the data in the presence of a potential discrepancy between the value of individual and value of social data will work, how it will work. This consumer data must be acquired, it's aggregated, it's packaged, and so we want to know who buys the consumer information equilibrium, where we typically or should we typically expect that in these data markets, the equilibrium will provide an efficient use of information, efficient exchange of information. Focus in particular on the social dimension of data, and therefore we want to think about what will happen to the price and to the efficiency of the trade in the presence of this information. We want to think about that in terms of a model that captures in a highly stylized, but nonetheless, we think, descriptive way, what are the main drivers for demand. So let me right away jump into the model that I'm going to propose today. There are then any number of variations that will follow in the paper, but let's think about a very simple and stark setting where we think about a data broker. Think about this as a platform possibly collecting information from end consumers, and then transferring it and selling it to a producer who can use the information about the consumer demand to match his offers better to want to think about each consumer having a willingness to pay, WI, which is composed of what we want to call a common demand shock, common to all of the individuals, that is theta, and an idiosyncratic demand shock, which is specific to individual. And today we're going to stay within a linear quadratic framework, so the uncertainty is going to be normally distributed and the preferences are going to be linear. Eventually, what the consumers will do, they will choose a product and the quantity of that product, QI, and they will have to pay a price, PI, possibly personalized, for certain quantity. Producer who would like to have information about the demand of the consumers is essentially just trying to maximize the net revenue that gets from selling. So this is what we want to think about the product market, the simple standard interaction between many consumers and the firm who is uncertain about the true demand for its product. Think about the product market essentially as a downstream market. There's an upstream market, the data market, which helps eliciting the information from the consumers and transforming it in some form to the consumer. So we want to think about the data broker as buying data from the individuals and then selling it to the producer. We want to think about this as all happening in terms of a bilateral contract, that is, the intermediary buys data from the individuals and then repackages, aggregates it, and sells it to the producer. The data broker has a choice in both in terms of how much information to take in and how much of the information to sell out. So there's going to be an inflow policy. That is, how much data do I want to take in, and how much data do I want to then sell to the producer. So we want to think about the data broker basically acquiring information from about individual I that's going to lead to a signal that they are collecting from individual I. That signal, that information can include as input, of course, information from consumer I. It can also include information from consumer J, to the extent that that's predictive. And the weights that the intermediary wants to give to that information, that's part of the information design that the intermediary has to engage. Any information will, of course, only flow to the intermediary if the consumer consented, agreed to participate in the information chain. Two leading cases that we're going to analyze in the paper is the one which we want to think about as matched information. That is, we're going to provide information about consumer I that just includes information about consumer I. So that we're going to only forward information that pertains to consumer I and not otherwise. That's the indicator function. Or we can think about anonymizing the data, in which case we basically forwarding the same information just as an average over all of the signals that we have got. Any other form is also possible, but it will become clear that it would be optimal in some sense to choose between these two leaders.
Is there a particular reason for having both common and idiosyncratic shock? Is there a particular reason for having both epsilon and epsilon j?
Oh, good. And then the second part I have mentioned here is we do want to allow the intermediary to coarsen the information that he receives from the consumer and inject noise to allow for more privacy. So we want to allow both for a common shock as well as for an idiosyncratic shock to be used.
But is that part of the design, or is it?
That's part of the design. So as part of design, we're going to determine from the intermediary's point of view the weights that we're going to attach and the noise that we're going to inject. So I said we want to think about an idealized model. That means we're going to think about the exchange of data as being governed by a contract by which the consumers are going to possibly compensate it for the data that they're providing. Okay. Therefore, they're going to be participation constraint for the consumer, and likewise the firm paying for the data that it's going to expend. We think about these payments as happening and the contracts happening from an ex-ante point of view. So think about this as sort of used to agree terms of usage agreements. That is, we're going to make an agreement before we actually know the realization of our business. Then whatever information we want to realize is simply going to pass along according to the contract. Now, stylus in the sense that often consumers do not get actually compensated monetarily for the information. Often they get compensated in terms of services, but that is just another currency, and so today we're just going to think about this as monetary. So the timing of the game then is simply the data broker offers some ex-ante payments, hoping that the consumers agree to share the data. Whatever data he has acquired, he can then package, repackage, and sell to the merchant. And after that contractual statement, the data flows as agreed in the contract, and then the merchant or the producer is going to use the information that he had about the consumers to basically match the prices at which he offers his product better to the realized demand of the consumers. That's the setting that we want to think about. So a lot of triangles, or quasi-triangles today. Another one, think about the interaction of the consumers in the firm as a downstream market, and think about the upstream market as the data market, where we're going to push along information, and we're going to get either compensated for it or we're receiving services. So there are many variations we can play this through, right? So if you think about search engines, then actually I'm not getting compensated, but I get search results. The advertisers are then bidding for the search results and using information that Google gives them about the characteristics of the consumers that they're searching. About Facebook, a lot of the information flow goes through the apps that Facebook offers. Likewise, the monetary flow goes, but the basic idea is going to be downstream market and that's upstream. Okay, so let me go give you basically two views on this world. Okay, the first is the one which I want to call data in the wild, which is basically say what would happen in this market if somehow the information of the consumers were freely available in the downstream market, and therefore the firm could use all the information about its demand to optimally match its prices to demand. And then we're going to think about what would happen if now we give the consumer the control over its information. We allow an intermediary to move in, and we then are going to pursue what the social aspect and the data externality will do to the efficiency of the market and to the prices at which this information flows in the data. So, data in the wild. So suppose the demand information will simply be known to the merchant. Then ideally what the merchant would do is simply offer a personal priced PI star, which basically matches the demand, allows the consumer then, given the price, expresses preferences, and will lead to realized demand, which is the key feature here is that the ability of the firm to respond to the information allows it to move the price in the same direction as the demand, and therefore part of the value that's being created through higher demand is going to be absorbed by higher prices. So this model will, of course, not lead to an efficient allocation because the monopolist is responding to the demand. In other words, the demand is raising only half the rate it would in the efficient way. So if you think about what's the impact, what's the influence that data has on the consumer surplus, then in the linear quadratic world, this has a very nice expression. It simply tells us that if you compare what the consumer surplus would get in the absence of any data, and what he gets once his data is known, okay, is simply described in terms of the variance and the covariance. In the linear quadratic models, all the uncertainty washes out in terms of the means of the prices and the quantities, and so the welfare analysis can exclusively be recast in terms of the variance and the covariance. And so if you add up consumer surplus and producer surplus, then what you will find is that what is left is a negative term of the variance in the prices. That means more information will actually reduce the welfare here because it allows more surplus extraction by the producers. So the demand data, which you're going to give to the producer, doesn't indeed increase the profit, but it decreases the consumer surplus, and in fact, the net outcome is going to be a decrease in the social service.
Two things I've missed. At the first stage, when you buy the data, does the consumer already know his or her type?
No, he doesn't know.
So
we said we're going to take an example point of view.
Okay, and then the it's a bit sensitive to the way you price. I mean, for example, with a two-part tariff, it would be good actually to have the information, because then you maximize the surplus, and you have to compensate the consumer. So isn't that a bit sensitive to the kind of pricing scheme that you are using?
The exact prediction of what happens in market is sensitive, but what you will see is that we haven't yet talked about the data externality. That is going to be completely insensitive to the modeling of the downstream market, and that's what really is the focus of. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of emphasize what is the effect of information in this market, and by intent, we chose, in some sense, a downstream market interaction where information has negative value. Yet we're going to see that a data market will come into existence. We were going to let the information flow, and it's precisely due to the data externality that I want to formulate now. Okay, so if I get the data point, it might not be perfect data. It clearly helps me in terms of estimating the demand. So it gives me variance in my conditional estimate. But it will also, in the presence of a common demand shock, give me variance in the conditional expectation about the aggregate. We want to think about the data externality that's at the core of the pricing problem then for the data as the difference in the consumer surplus that will occur if there's no information exchange versus what will happen to consumer I if he himself does not choose to pass along the information, but will be faced with the fact that others will provide information about. So we saw that the consumer surplus from information is negative, so clearly the consumer must be compensated for providing the information. But there is an externality, okay? Because his information does not only give information about consumer I, but it also helps the firm to predict demand about the others. For that, naturally, consumer I is not compensated, and the reverse of that is the sale of information by I is harmful to consumer J, and therefore consumer J is not going to be compensated, and that means there's going to be quite a gap between the private price of data and the social cost of social price of data. So now let's move very quickly to a world where there is the possibility of data intermediation, where the consumers do indeed have control over the data, so they can choose to withhold the data. And their choice to provide the data occurs when they're compensated at their privately correct rate. Okay. The broker's profits, we saw earlier on, is basically the difference in the total surplus from the information and the data externality, because he doesn't have to pay for that. Okay. So the first question that we have is, how does a broker want to provide the information? The answer is going to be, he doesn't want to provide information to the user at the level of the individual, but he wants to collect the information from the individuals and then provide aggregate. So it would be optimal to actually anonymize the data, to not sell it to the producer with the label of consumer I, but rather aggregate the data and then let the producer use the aggregate. The second result that we're going to think about is, what is the optimal way for the intermediary to do data intermediation? You are showing me your search result. Thank you. Yes, please. My time is almost over. So let me therefore just walk you through this result and then I'm done. Okay. So what we're going to show, what we show is that there indeed exists a threshold under which there will be scope for data intermediation as soon as the number of consumers is large enough. The broker's profit is increasing in the data externality, meaning in the variance of the common demand shock, but is decreasing in the idiosyncratic shock, because for that he actually has to compensate the individual. Okay. The data broker will never add idiosyncratic noise. Okay. But if the idiosyncratic shock is large, or he has just a small number of consumers, he's going to inject additional noise so as to lower the compensation that he has to offer the consumer. So for him, there's an optimal trade-off of how much information to provide and what's the cost of procuring that information. Let me start, maybe give you one implication that's sort of relevant for the discussion that we had in the morning. Okay, so let me think about the limit case as the numbers of consumers become large. Let me think about what's the level of the individual compensation. Let me think about what is the broker's revenue from the merchant as we have more and more consumers. And as therefore, it appears that the social externality or the data externality becomes larger, because now I'm going to collect information from more and more consumers. Three results that are relevant here. Okay. The revenue per consumer that I'm going to get from the producer as a data intermediary, that per capita revenue is going to grow in N. Okay, and that's simply the fact that the cost of procuring that information is going to decrease. The revenue is going to eventually grow linearly in N. Okay. But importantly, the compensation that the intermediary has to offer to the consumers, we're here in the symmetric world, that is going to go against the finite constant, which means that the per person cost of acquiring information from individual one is eventually going to converge against zero. Okay. That is, the data externality is so large, if we have more and more consumers, that eventually the cost of procuring the information is finite, even though we have a very large number of consumers. So that gives us a little bit an idea of how the power of the data externality, I guess Pietro was talking about this in the morning, is so strong that frequently it can be the case that the compensation goes to zero, yet each individual consumer is willing to enter into the agreement, because the additional damage that this information does to his consumption is also negligible. There's not that much more that I can tell Google that they don't know about me. So we have additional results, but I think I should should end here. What I presented you today indeed were results from the point of view of a monopoly data intermediary and also monopoly producer. The perhaps a little bit depressing aspect is that a natural way of extending and making the market more competitive by introducing data intermediaries helps a little bit in terms of the privacy this is going to be accorded, but really doesn't change very much the nature of the data externality. And so competition among data intermediaries alone will not help, and sometimes may even hurt the consumer surplus in particular. And so this is another ongoing project that still has many more steps. Okay. Thank you very much.